Okay, we're gonna go live. Well, we are live. I am live. Chapter 6, Water and Dreams, Gaston Bachelard. Chapter 6, Purity and Purification, Water's Morality. Everything the heart desires can always be reduced to a water figure. Paul Claudel, Positions et Propositions. 1. I have no intention, naturally, of treating the problem of purity and purification in all its ramifications. At present, this is a problem that emerges from the philosophy of religious values. Purity is one of the fundamental categories of valorization and could even, perhaps, symbolize all values. A very condensed resume of this great problem may be found in Roger Callio's book, Man and the Sacred. My current aim is more limited, detached from everything related to ritual purity, without dwelling on formal purity rites. I want to show especially that material imagination finds in water a pure matter par excellence, a naturally pure matter. Water then offers itself as a natural symbol of purity. It gives precision to the prolix psychology of purification. It is this psychology, applied to material models, that I would like to sketch. No doubt, as sociologists have amply shown, social themes are the beginning for the great categories of valorization. In other words, true valorization is social in essence. It is made up of values that are readily interchangeable, that have a characteristic feature known and made known to all the members of the group. But I believe that we also must consider a valorization of reveries that are unexpressed, the reveries of a dreamer who flees from society, who claims the world as his sole companion. Certainly, this solitude is not complete. The isolated dreamer retains, for instance, those oneric values attached to language. He keeps the poetry that is peculiar to the language of his race. The words that he applies to things poeticize these things, valorize them spiritually in a way that cannot. The words that he applies to things poeticize these things, valorize them spiritually in a way that cannot completely escape the influence of traditions. The poet who has made the most innovations, exploiting a reverie freest from social habits, still bears in his poems seeds that spring from the social resources of the language. But forms and words are not all there is in poetry. To link them together, certain material themes are imperative. My specific task in this book is to prove that certain substances bring us to their oneric power, a kind of poetic solidity that gives unity to true poems. If things help put our ideas in order, then elementary matter does the same for our dreams. Elementary matter receives and preserves and exalts our dreams. The ideal of purity cannot be lodged just anywhere, in any matter. However powerful the purification rites be, they usually seek a matter that is capable of symbolizing them. clear water is a constant temptation for a facile symbolism of purity. Any man with no guide or social convention can discover this natural image. A physics of the imagination then must take this natural and direct discovery into account. It must examine attentively this attributing of a value to a material experience, which, in this way, shows itself to be more important than an ordinary experience. In the specific limited problem I am treating in this work, there is therefore a methodological obligation that forces me to set aside the sociological characteristics of the idea of purity. Here, especially, I must be very careful in the use of mythological evidence. I shall use it only when I find it quite prevalent in the work of poets or in solitary reverie. Thus, I shall relate everything to present day psychology. Though forms and concepts harden rapidly, material imagination still remains an active power. It alone can revitalize traditional images endlessly. It is the one that constantly breathes new life into certain old mythological forms. It gives life back to forms by transforming them. For a form cannot transform itself. It is contrary to its nature for a form to transform itself. If we encounter a transformation, we may be sure that material imagination is at work behind the metamorphosis. Culture transmits forms to us too often in mere words. If we knew how to rediscover, in spite of culture, a little natural reverie, a little reverie about nature, we would understand that symbolism is a material power. Our personal reverie would very naturally reform atavistic symbols because they are natural symbols. Once more, I must emphasize that a dream is a natural force, as we will have occasion to note again. No one can know purity without dreaming it. No one can dream it forcefully without seeing the mark, the proof, the substance of it in nature. 2. If I am sparring in my use of mythological documents, I must also refuse any reference to rational knowledge. One cannot construct a psychology of the imagination by founding it on rational principles as though they were a basic necessity. This psychological truth, so often hidden, will appear prominently in relation to the problem treated in this chapter. For the modern mind, the difference between pure and impure water is entirely a rational matter. Chemists and hygienists are responsible for that. When a sign over the water faucet designates drinkable water, the final word has been spoken, and every scruple vanishes. A rationalistic thinker meditating on an ancient text with limited psychological knowledge, such as our classical education so often produces, brings his precise knowledge like a recurrent light to the data in the text. No doubt he realizes that knowledge concerning the purity of waters is very unsound in those days, but he or she thinks, nevertheless, that this knowledge corresponds to very specific, very clear experiences. Under these conditions, interpretations of ancient texts are often overly clever readings. The modern reader too often pays homage to the ancients for their knowledge of natural phenomena. He or she forgets that knowledge thought to be direct is a part of a system that can be very artificial. He or she also forgets that the knowledge of natural phenomena is closely connected with natural reveries. It is these reveries that a psychologist studying the imagination must unearth. It is, above all, these reveries that we must reconstruct in order to interpret a text from a lost civilization. Not only must the facts be weighted, but the weight of the dreams must be determined. For everything of a literary nature is dreamed before being seen, even the simplest of descriptions. Let us read, for example, this old text by Hesiod, written 800 years before our era. Never urinate at the mouth of rivers which flow into the sea, nor at their source. Be very careful about this. Hesiod even adds, do not satisfy your other needs there either. It is no less dangerous. To explain these taboos, psychologists who claim that utilitarian views may be grasped directly will immediately find reasons for them. They will imagine a Hesiod concerned about the teachings of elementary hygiene, as if there were for man a natural hygiene. Is there even an absolute hygiene? There are so many ways of enjoying good health. In point of fact, only psychoanalytic explanations can see clearly through the taboos proclaimed by Hesiod. The proof is not far away. The text that I have just quoted is found on the same page as another taboo. Do not urinate while standing facing the sun. This one obviously has no utilitarian value. The practice it prohibits does not endanger the purity of light. From this point on, the explanation that is valid for one paragraph must be valid for the other. The virile protest against the sun, against the father symbol, is well known to psychoanalysts. The taboo that protects the sun from this outrage also protects the river. The single rule of primitive morality here defends the paternal majesty of the sun and the maternity of the waters. This taboo is still necessary today because of a permanent unconscious drive. Pure, clear water, in fact, is for the unconscious a summons to pollution. How many tainted fountains there are in the country. It is not always a question of deliberate meanness, delighting in the anticipated disappointment of passers-by. The crime aims higher than an offense against men. There is, in certain of its characteristics, a sacrilegious tone. It is an outrage against nature, the mother. Therefore, in legends, there are numerous punishments inflicted on vulgar passers-by by the powers of nature personified. Here, for example, is a legend from Lower Normandy that has been recorded by Selbiot. The fairies who have just surprised a boar who has polluted their fountain are in secret conference. What do you wish for the one who muddied our water, my sister? What do you wish for the one who muddied our water, my sister? that he become a stammerer and never be able to articulate a word. And you, my sister, that he always go about with his mouth open and standing gaping in the street. And you, my sister, that he never take a step without, in all due respect to you, breaking wind. Such tales have lost their power to act on the unconscious and their one-rick force. When they are passed on now, it is with a smile because they are picturesque. Therefore, they can no longer protect our fountains. Let us note, moreover, that the prohibitions of public hygiene, developed in an atmosphere of rationality, cannot replace these tales. To fight against an unconscious drive, an active story, a fable that could spin itself out on the very axis of one-rick drives would be required. These one-rick drives work on us for good as well as for evil. We sympathize obscurely with the drama of the purity and impurity of water. Who, for instance, does not feel a special, irrational, unconscious, direct repugnance for a dirty river? For a river dirtied by sewers and factories. We deeply resent this great unnatural, this great natural beauties being ruined by men. Huysmans plays on this repugnance, this rancor, to heighten the tone of certain imprecatory phrases, to make certain of his scenes truly demoniacal. For example, he expatiates upon the despairing attitude of Bevray today, dirtied by the city, that river in rags, that strange river, that dumping ground for filth, that bilge, which is the color of slate and melted lead, frothing here and there, with greenish eddies stared with muddied spittle, which gurgles on the sluice gate and is lost, sobbing in the holes of a wall. Its places the water seems crippled and eaten away with leprosy. It stagnates and stirs its flowing suit and takes up its journey again, slowed down by Maya. The Baivare is nothing but a moving dung heap. Let us note in passing water's ability to take on organic metaphors. Many other passages could demonstrate through their absurdity the unconscious value attached to pure water. In the threat to pure crystalline water, we can measure the fervor with which we greet in their freshness and youth the stream, the spring, the river, and all reservoirs of natural limpidity. We feel that metaphors of limpidity and freshness will be secure as soon as they become attached to such directly valorized realities. We feel that metaphors of limpidity and freshness will be secure as soon as they become attached to such directly valorized realities. 3. Of course, the natural and concrete experiences of purity include other, more sensual factors that are closer to material dream than those contributed by sight or the simple contemplation on which Huysmans' rhetoric elaborates. To understand fully the value of pure water, one must revolt with all the power of disappointed thirst after a summer's walk against the vineyardist who has steeped his wicker basket in a familiar spring against all profaners, those Atlas of springs who take a sadistic pleasure in stirring up the stream's bed after drinking from it. The country dweller, better than any other, knows the value of pure water because he knows that its purity is in danger, because he knows enough to drink clear, fresh water at the right moment, in those rare moments when the insipid has a flavor, when our whole being desires pure water. In contrast to this simple but complete pleasure, we can formulate a psychology of surprisingly diverse and numerous metaphors of bitter and salty water, of bad water. These metaphors collectively form a repugnance that conceals 1,000 variations. A simple reference to pre-scientific thought helps us understand the essential complexity of inadequately rationalized impurity. Let me mention first that it is not the same thing at all on the present day scientific level. A chemical analysis today can designate bad water or undrinkable water in precise qualifying terms. If the analysis reveals an impurity, we can say the water contains selenium, milestone, or bacilli. If the impurities are many, the epithets still appear simply as juxtaposed. They remain isolated, having been discovered in separate experiments. On the other hand, the pre-scientific mentality, like the unconscious, amasses adjectives. Thus, after an examination of foul water, the author of a book in the 18th century projects his judgment, his disgust, in 6 epithets. The water is said to be at once bitter, nitrous, salty, sulfurous, bituminous, 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 and nauseating. What are these adjectives if not curses? They belong more to a psychological analysis of repugnance than to an objective analysis of matter. They represent the sum total of a drinker's grimaces. They do not represent, as historians of science too readily believe, the sum total of empirical knowledge. The meaning of pre-scientific research cannot be thoroughly understood until we have formulated a psychology of the seeker. Impurity, as far as the unconscious is concerned, is always multiple, always abundant. It has a polyvalent noxiousness. From this point on, it is understandable that impure water can be accused of all possible misdeeds if, for the conscious mind, it is accepted as a simple symbol of evil, as an external symbol. For the unconscious, it is the object of an active symbolization that is entirely internal, entirely substantial. Impure water for the unconscious is a receptacle for evil, one open to every evil. It is the substance of evil. Thus, foul water can be loaded with an infinite number of evil spells. It can be cursed, that is. Through it, evil can be put in active form. In doing this, we satisfy the requirements of material imagination, which needs a substance in order to understand an action. In water thus cursed, a sign is all that is necessary. What is evil in one aspect, in one of its characteristics, becomes evil as a whole. Evil is no longer a quality but a substance. This is the reason why the slightest impurity devalorizes pure water completely. It is an opportunity for a curse. It receives a maleficent thought naturally. We can see that the moral axiom of absolute purity, destroyed forever by one pernicious thought, is perfectly symbolized by water that has lost a little of its limpidity and its freshness. By examining with an attentive, hypnotized eye the impurities in water, by interrogating water as we would our own conscience, we can hope to read a man's destiny in it. Certain processes in Hydromancy refer to the clouds that float in water when an egg, white, or liquid substances which produce very curious arborescent trails are dropped into it. There are dreamers who concentrate on troubled water. They gaze in wonder at black ditch water, at water permeated by bubbles, at water that shows the veins within its substance and that raises as if by itself a swirl of silt. Then it seems as though the water itself dreams and is covered over with a nightmarish vegetation. This one-rick vegetation is already induced by a reverie when one contemplates water plants. Aquatic flora is, for some people, a true exoticism, a temptation to dream of a beyond far from the sun's flowers and a life of limpidity. Numerous are the impure dreams that flourish in water, that lie heavily on water like the huge webbed hand of a water lily. Many are the impure dreams in which the sleeping man feels circulating in him and around him black and muddy currents, rivers Styx whose heavy waters are burdened with evil. The heart is stirred by this dynamics of blackness, and our sleeping eyes follow endlessly black upon black, this becoming of blackness. The Manichaeism of pure and impure water, however, is far from being a balanced one. The moral balance leans unquestionably toward purity, toward the good side. Water is inclined toward good. Taboos, who analyzed an enormous folklore on water, is struck by the smaller number of cursed fountains. The devil is rarely associated with fountains, and very few bear his name, while a great number are named for saints and many for fae. 4. Nor must we assign a rational basis too readily to the numerous themes of purification by water. To purify oneself is not purely and simply to wash. There is no justification for speaking of the need for cleanliness as a primitive need that man might have recognized with his inborn wisdom. Very well informed sociologists have allowed themselves to fall into this trap. Thus, Edward Tylor, after recounting that the Zulus perform many ablutions to purify themselves after attending funerals, adds, "It is to be noticed that these ceremonial practices have come to mean something distinct from mere cleanliness. But to affirm that these practices have come to mean something different from the original meaning, we must have documents concerning this original meaning. Very often there is nothing in the archaeology of customs that allows us to grasp an original meaning which brought a useful, reasonable, and healthy practice into being." Tylor himself gives us evidence of a kind of purification by water that has no connection with a regard for cleanliness. Kafirs, who will purify themselves from ceremonial uncleanness by washing, are not in the habit of washing themselves for ordinary purposes. Thus, this paradox emerges. The kafir washes his body only when his soul is dirty. Many jump to the conclusion that people who are meticulous in the matter of purification by water are worried about hygienic cleanliness. Tylor also makes this remark. The faithful Persian carries the principle of removing legal uncleanness by ablution so far that a holy man will wash his eyes when they have been polluted by the sight of an infidel. He will carry about a water pot with a long spout for his ablutions, yet he depopulates the land by his neglect of the simplest sanitary rules, and he may be seen by the side of the little tank where scores of people have been in before him, obliged to clear with his hand a space in the foul scum on the water before he plunges into obtain ceremonial purity. This time, pure water is so highly valorized that nothing, it seems, can defile it. It is a substance of good. Rode is another scholar who fails to avoid certain rationalizations, recalling the principle that recommends the use for purification of water from gushing springs or rivers. He adds, in water thus drawn from running sources, the power of washing off and carrying away the evil still seemed to be inherent. When the pollution is usually severe, it has to be purged by the water from several running springs. Even the water from 14 different springs might be useful as a purification from murder. Claudel does not emphasize clearly enough that running water, gushing water, is primitively living water. It is this life that remains attached to its substance which accomplishes the purification. The rational value, the fact that the current carries, refuse away. It is easy to refute for anyone to hold it in the slightest esteem. It is the result of reasoning. All purity is, in fact, act substantial. All purification must be thought of as the action of a substance. The psychology of purification is dependent on material imagination and not on an external experience. On a primitive level, then, we require of pure water a purity both active and substantial. Through purification, one participates in a fertile, renovating, polyvalent force. The best proof of this inner power is that it is contained in each drop of the liquid. The texts in which purification appears as a simple aspersion are innumerable. Fassi, in his book Syrian Magic, stresses the fact that in purification by water, it is never a question of immersion, but ordinarily of aspersions, either isolated or repeated 7 or 2 times 7 times. In the Aeneid, 3 times he, Corinius, Corinaeus, I don't know how to say that name in the Aeneid. In the Aeneid, 3 times he, Corinius, passes among the company bearing pure water and the auspicious olive branch with which he sprinkles the men lightly and purifies them. For many points of view, it seems that washing is the metaphor, the translation in plain language, and that aspersion is the real operation. That is, the operation that brings reality to the act. Aspersion, then, is dreamed of as the primary operation. This is what produces the maximum psychological reality. In the 50th Psalm, the idea of aspersion really appears to precede, as reality, the metaphor of washing. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. The hyssop of the Hebrews was the smallest of the flowers they knew. It was probably Bachelard tells us, a moss used for sprinkling. A few drops of water then will give purity. The prophet then sings, wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. It is because water has an inner power that it can purify the inner being, that it can give back to the sinful soul the whitest of snow. He who has been sprinkled physically is cleansed morally. Moreover, this is not an unusual fact, but indeed an example of a fundamental law of material imagination. For material imagination, the valorized substance, even in an infinitesimal quantity. Moreover, this is not an unusual fact, but indeed an example of a fundamental law of material imagination. For material imagination, the valorized substance, even in an infinitesimal quantity, can act on a large mass of other substances. This is the very law of the reverie of power, to hold a small amount of something in the hollow of one's hand, by means of which one can dominate a universe. This is, in concrete form, the same ideal as knowing the key word, a little word that unlocks the most hidden of secrets. In the dialectical theme of the purity and impurity of water, this fundamental law of material imagination acts in both directions, guaranteeing the eminently active nature of the substance. 1 drop of pure water suffices to purify an ocean. One drop of impure water suffices to defile a universe. Everything depends on the moral direction of the action chosen by material imagination. If it is dreaming of evil, it can propagate impurity, can cause the diabolical seed to bloom. If it dreams of good, it will have confidence in one drop of pure substance and be able to cause its beneficial purity to shine forth. The action of the substance is dreamed like a substantial becoming, desired in the inner recesses of the substance. Basically, it is the destiny of a person. This action can then change any circumstances, surmount all obstacles, break down all barriers. Wicked water is insinuating, pure water is subtle. In both of these directions, water has become will. All utilitarian qualities, all superficial values are reduced to the status of lesser properties. It is the interior that governs. It is from a central point, the condensed will, that substantial action radiates. By meditating on this action of the pure and the impure, we can grasp how material imagination is transformed into dynamic imagination. No longer are pure and impure waters thought of only as substances. They are thought of as forces. For example, pure matter radiates in the physical sense of the term. It radiates purity. Conversely, it is also liable to absorb. It can then serve to gather purity in a single mass. Let me borrow an example from the Count of Garbalis's Conversations by the Abbé de Villiers. No doubt these conversations have a bantering tone, but there are some passages that are serious. These are the very ones in which material imagination becomes dynamic. Among some rather meager fantasies with no one-writ value, there is interposed a line of reasoning that valorizes purity in a curious way. How does the Count of Gabalis evoke the spirits which roam abroad in the universe? Not by means of Kabbalistic formulae, but by means of well-defined chemical operations. It is enough, he thinks, to purify the element that corresponds to the spirits. With the help of concave mirrors, he concentrates the fire from the sun's rays in a glass globe. There will be formed a solar powder, which, having purged itself of any mixture with other elements, a solar power which, having purged itself of any mixture with other elements, becomes eminently fitted for magnifying the fire which is in us and for making us become, in a manner of speaking, of a fiery nature. From that time on, those who inhabit the sphere of fire become our inferiors, and delighted to see our mutual harmony re-established, and to see us become nearer to them. They extend to us the same friendship which they have for their own kind. As long as the sun's fire is dispersed, it can have no effect on our vital fire. Condensation first produces its materialization, then gives dynamic value to the pure substance. The elementary spirits are attracted by the elements. One more little metaphor, and we can understand that this attraction is a kind of friendship. We yield, after all this chemistry, to psychology. In the same way, for the Count of Gabalis, water becomes a marvelous magnet to attract nymphs. The purified water is nymphicized. It will then be, in its substance, the material rendezvous of nymphs. Thus, without ceremonies and without barbaric words, without demons and without unlawful art, says the Abbé de Villiers, by the physics of purity alone, the wise man becomes absolute master of elementary spirits. To govern spirits, it is necessary only to become a skillful distiller. The relationship is reestablished between spiritual spirits and material spirits as soon as one has discovered how to separate elements by elements. The use of the word gas, the Flemish derivative of the word Geist, mind, spirit, gives rise to a materialistic thought that brings its metaphoric process to the following conclusion. A doublet is based on a pleonasm, Pleonasm. Instead of saying that a spiritual spirit is a material spirit, or more simply that a spirit is spiritual, we should say, in analyzing the Count of Gabalis and intuition, that an elemental spirit is or has become an element. We progress from the adjective to the substantive, from qualities to a substance. Conversely, when we yield completely to material imagination, the material dreamed in its elemental power will rise to become a spirit, a will. 5. One of the characteristics that must be joined to the dream of purification that limpid water suggests is the dream of renovation suggested by fresh water. One dives into water in order to be reborn and changed. In the hanging gardens, Stefan George hears a wave murmuring, "Dive into me so that you can rise up out of me." By this we should understand, so that you can be conscious of rising up. The fountain of youth is a very complex metaphor deserving of a long study devoted exclusively to it. Setting aside everything in this metaphor that comes from psychoanalysis, I shall limit myself to a few very specific remarks to show how freshness, a very clear corporal sensation, becomes a metaphor so far removed from its physical basis that we can speak of a fresh landscape, a fresh painting, a literary passage full of freshness. The psychology of this metaphor is not dealt with, it is conjured away when we say that between the real and the figurative meanings there is a correspondence. Such a correspondence would then be only an association of ideas. In point of fact, it is a living union of sense impressions. For one who truly lives out the evolutions of material imagination, there is no figurative meaning. All figurative meanings retain a certain amount of sense impressions, a certain matter perceptible to the senses. Everything depends on determining what this persistent, perceptible matter is. Everyone has in his or her own home a fountain of youth, in his or her basin of cold water on a morning bursting with energy. And without this trivial experience, the complex belonging to the poet, to the poetic fountain of youth, could perhaps never have been formulated. Fresh water awakens and gives youth to one's face. That place where a man sees himself growing old and where he would like to keep others from seeing him age. But fresh water does not rejuvenate our faces for others so much as for ourselves. Beneath the wakened brow gleams a new eye. Fresh water puts fire back in the eye. There lies the principle of inversion that explains the true freshness of the contemplation of water. It is our outlook that is refreshed. If we truly participate through material imagination in one's water substance, we project a fresh outlook, the impression of freshness that the invisible world gives is an expression that the awakened man projects on things. It is impossible to realize this without making use of a psychology of sensory projection. In the early morning, water on one's face reawakens an energy for seeing. It makes sight active, makes a glance an action, a clear, distinct, easy action. Then one is strongly tempted to attribute a youthful freshness to what is seen. The oracle at Colophon, Iamblichus, tells us, prophesied by water. The oracle at Colophon, Iamblichus, tells us, prophesies by water. Now, while water does not communicate the complete divine inspiration to us, it does furnish us with the desired aptitude and purifies the luminous breath within us. Pure light through pure water, such seems to us to be the psychological principle of lustration. Near water, light takes on a tonality. It seems that light has more clarity when it meets clear water. Metzu, Delphi Gautier tells us, painted in a pavilion situated in the middle of a small body of water to preserve the integrality of his hues, to be faithful to the projective psychology, I would prefer to say the integrality of his observation. We are moved to see a scene with limpid eyes when we have reserves of limpidity. A scene's freshness is a way of looking at it. Doubtless, the scene has to contribute to. It must have some greenery and a little water. But material imagination has the longer task. This direct action of the imagination is obvious when we come to literary imagination. A style's freshness is its most difficult quality. It depends on the writer, not the subject treated. To the fountain of youth, complex is naturally linked the hope for cure. To the fountain of youth, complex is naturally linked the hope for a cure. To the fountain of youth, complex is naturally linked the hope for a cure. A cure by water in its imaginary principle can be considered from the double point of view of material imagination and dynamic imagination. From the first viewpoint, the theme is so clear that we need only state it. We attribute to water virtues that are antithetic to the ills of a sick person. Man projects his desire to be cured and dreams of a compassionate substance. We should not be too amazed at the large number of medical studies that the 18th century devoted to mineral water and thermic waters. Our century dwells less on this subject. It is easy to see that these pre-scientific studies arise more from psychology than from chemistry. They inscribe a psychology of the patient and the doctor in water's substance. The point of view of dynamic imagination is more general and less complex. The first dynamic lesson of water is, in fact, elementary. A man asks the fountain as the first proof of his cure to revitalize him. Our feeling refreshed provides the common everyday reason for this reawakening. Water helps us, through its fresh and youthful substance, to feel energetic ourselves. In the chapter devoted to violent water, we shall see that water can add to its teachings on energy. But from now on, we must realize that hydrotherapeutics is not simply peripheral. It has a central component. It awakens the nerve centers. It has a moral component. It awakens man to the energetic life. Hygiene, then, is a poem. Purity and freshness join together in this way to give a special happiness, which all water lovers know. The union of the sensory and the sensual upholds a moral value. The contemplation and experience of water lead us by many routes to an ideal. We should not underestimate the lessons taught by original matters. They have left their mark on our mind's youth. They are necessarily a reserve of youth. We discover them in connection with our most personal memories. And when we dream, when we truly lose ourselves in our dreams, we submit to the vegetative and restorative life of an element. It is only when we realize the substantial qualities of the water of youth that we rediscover in our own dreams myths of birth, water in its maternal power, water which gives life in death, beyond death, as Jung has shown. This reverie on the water of youth is then so natural a reverie that we can scarcely understand writers who try to rationalize it. Let us call to mind, for instance, that poor drama by Ernest Renan, Water of Youth. In it can be seen a lucid writer's ineptitude for living alchemic intuitions. He confines himself to covering the modern idea of distillation with fables. Arnaud de Villeneuve, in the character of Prospero, believes it necessary to defend his brandy, water of life, against the charges of contributing to our fine and dangerous products. Must be sipped carefully. It is our fault if, because they gulp them down, certain people die while we live. Is it our fault if, because they gulp them down, certain people die while we live? Reman has not seen that alchemy grows principally out of magic psychology. It is almost a poem. It is closer to dreams than to objective experiences. The water of youth is an oneric power. It cannot serve as a pretext for an historian who toys for an instant and so awkwardly with an anachronism. The water of youth is an one rick power. It cannot serve as a pretext for an historian who toys for an instant and so awkwardly with an anachronism. 6. As I said at the beginning of this chapter, these remarks fail to get to the heart of the problem of a relationship between purification and natural purity. The problem of natural purity would itself require extensive exposition. Let it suffice for us to evoke an intuition that casts some doubt on this natural purity. Thus, while studying the spirit of liturgy by Romano Guardini, Ernest Sidberre writes, consider water, for example, so perfidious, so dangerous too, in its movements and gyrations, which resemble incantations or spells, in its eternal unrest. Well, then, liturgical rites of benediction exorcise and neutralize whatever malevolent element may be hiding in its depths, curb its demoniacal powers, and awakening in its powers which are more suitable to its good nature, discipline its intangible and mysterious powers which they put in the service of the soul, all the while stifling what is magical, engaging and bad in it. Anyone who has not experienced that insists our poet of Christian ceremonies does not understand nature. But liturgy penetrates its secrets and shows us that in it are sleeping the same latent powers as are in the souls of men. And Sirere shows that this conception of the demonizing of water within its substance is deeper than the intuition of Clagis, which do not carry this demoniacal influence so far. In Guardini's estimation, it is truly the material element that symbolizes within its substance our own substance. Guardini agrees with Friedrich von Schegel's insight, according to which the malicious spirit acts directly on the physical elements. According to this viewpoint, the sinful soul is already an evil water. The liturgical act that purifies the water inclines the corresponding human substance toward purification. Thus emerges the theme of consubstantial purification, the need to extirpate the evil of all of nature, evil in the heart of man as well as evil in the heart of things. The moral life is like the imaginative life in this respect. Both are cosmic. The whole world wants to be renewed. Material imagination dramatizes the world in its depths. It finds in the depth of substances all the symbols of inner human life. It is understandable then that pure water, the substance, water in itself, may take the place for some imaginations of a primordial matter, It appears to be a kind of substance of substances, of which all other substances are attributed. Other substances are attributed. Thus, in his project for an underground church in Chicago, Paul Claudel is sure of finding in the innermost part of the earth a genuine essential water, a substantially religious water, a substantially religious water. If one digs in the earth, one finds water, the bottom of the sacred basin, around which would crowd row upon row of thirsty souls, which then be filled with a lake. This is not the place to elaborate upon the immense symbolism of water, which chiefly signifies the sky. This underground lake, dreamed of by the visionary poet, will thus result in a subterranean sky. Water, in its symbolism, can bring everything together. Claudel goes on to say, everything the heart desires can always be reduced to a water figure. Water, the greatest of desires, is the truly inexhaustible divine gift. This interior water, this subterranean lake from which an altar rises, will be a basin for decanting polluted waters. Through its mere presence, it will purify an enormous city. It will be a kind of material monastery that will pray without ceasing in the interiority and permanence of its very substance. Many other proofs could be found in theology for the metaphysical purity of a substance. I have kept only that which concerns the metaphysics of the imagination. A great poet imagines intuitively the values that belong naturally to a profound life.